This one chart proves the global elite's plan, or the Thanos plan, aka net zero by 2050, is evil. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the chart I am referring to. And for my regular viewers, got to apologize about the glasses again. Still dealing with the recovery process from eye surgery. Okay, let's get into this chart. The lower horizontal line represents population quantile. Very fancy word here. We go from 0% all the way up to 100%. On the left, or the vertical line, we have gigas. This is not gigachads. This is gigajoules. This is a representation or a measurement of energy use. We go from 0 all the way up to 300. So you can see here on the left, we have different countries or different groups of countries and how much energy they use. So at the very top, we have the top 20% of the United States. So the richest 20% of the U.S. population uses about 300 gigas per year in energy, end energy use. Now, the average United States, the average American, about 200. Then we go down to Germany, Italy, Japan, and then the bottom 20% within these countries. And one thing you'll note on the chart, I think they've got the abbreviation for Germany wrong. So I went ahead and changed it to DEU instead of DUE. But for Germany, Italy, Japan, the average there, about 100 gigajoules per year. Bottom 20%, about 50. Then we go down to India. I believe that's Tanzania, and Ethiopia. We'll call it 25. Now, what's fascinating, and we'll get into this more in step number 2, is how they're actually measuring the use of energy. So if right off the bat, this chart doesn't make a lot of sense, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, time out here. The top 20% in the United States use triple the energy of the people in Germany and Japan? What? We'll explain more in step number 2. But let's move over to the right of this chart. And here's where it gets extremely scientific. They show that, well, according to them, you would be considered super rich. In fact, I think they use the word global elite, ironically enough, if you use over, let's say, 250 gigajoules per year. Now, if you only use about maybe 75 or 50, this is fairly large inequality. Now, you say to yourself, well, who determines what is unequal? Well, of course, they do. That's the whole point. They can use whatever definition they decide is appropriate, and you just have to live with it. And then we move down to the lowest point, and this is what they're calling fair inequality. So we go from super rich to fairly large inequality to what is fair inequality. Fair as defined by them. So the objective of this chart, and we'll get into the original paper more throughout the rest of this video, is to argue that the people in the United States, and for the most part, Western civilization, should use far less energy. Because if they don't, then we're going to run into this climate disaster. It's eerily similar to Thanos' argument in the Avenger movies. And if you think I'm being absolutely ridiculous, just wait until step number 3. And we see that the scientists, quote unquote, are actually referencing this movie. I'm not joking, but getting back to the chart, they use this to argue that we should be using far less energy. But then this begs the question, well, wait a minute. We know that as people get richer and richer and richer, their standard of living improves, so does the amount of energy they use. So if they're using this chart to argue that the West should use less energy. If they're going to be intellectually honest, they're also going to argue that poor people, even in India, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, should never use more energy. In other words, we want to make sure that the poor people stay poor. But unfortunately, there is one more conclusion you could draw from this chart. And this is where it starts to get, well, we'll use the word evil. And I don't think that's too strong of a word. And I believe you'll agree with me as we go through the rest of this video. Let's think about this. If the goal is less energy use, because more energy use or the same amount of energy use leads to climate disaster and the end of the world, and we know that people just naturally, as they get richer, well, they're going to use more energy. We could either limit the amount of energy people use, especially in these poor countries, or we could just limit or reduce the amount of people that actually live or exist, not just in the poor countries, but on the planet Earth. Step number 2. Okay, now let's go right into the source document from the chart that we reviewed in step number 1. Step number 3, we'll get right back to the whiteboard. And this article is from nature.com, an extremely reputable source from those people that, quote unquote, follow the science. You guys know exactly what I mean, going back to the cerveza sickness. Okay, the title of the article: Inequality can double the energy required to secure universal decent living. And what's interesting about this, first off, is whenever you read articles like this or that argue something that I would consider evil, and I think most of you will agree with me when we get done actually reading the article, they always, it's like the World Economic Forum. They never really explicitly state what their policy objectives are or what their solutions are. They always kind of tap dance around the subject, and you have to read between the lines. But one thing is usually consistent is they start off the articles or their blog posts in a way that's very generalized, to say the least, to where you really can't understand what they're saying. It's all just like a word salad. But as the article progresses and as you get to the end, that's when they usually start revealing their true colors. And so let me not put words in their mouth. Again, let's go right to the source document for the chart we went over in step number 1. So we got the title there, but now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Energy costs of inequality appear far more significant than population. Wait a minute. Far more significant than population. Okay, so that's the first thing that should make your spidey senses start to tingle. Even fare levels increase the energy required to provide universal decent living. According to whom? And who defines what decent is? By 40%. And a super rich global 1%. And what's funny here is they talk about the super rich global elite. They're not referring to the World Economic Forum. I can promise you that. They're referring to basically Americans and people who live in the West. So the super rich global elite, 1%, according to them, could consume as much energy as would providing decent, there's that word again, living to 1.7 billion. We finish by arguing total population remains important nonetheless. So for someone who just reads the intro or the abstract, it seems very benign. But what you see is they're just using the term population as a synonym for population reduction. So whenever you see the word population, as though this is a problem, they're talking about too many human beings being alive on the planet Earth. So let's go ahead and reread this sentence the way it actually should read based on their intentions. We finish by arguing that depopulation, or lowering the population, remains important nonetheless, but for reasons far beyond ecological impacts. And I think one of the conclusions you guys will come to after we go through this is it seems as though the climate extremists of today are just another version of the eugenicists of the early 1900s. So moving down the article, the next thing I'd like to point out, a key finding is that while some countries manage to achieve good social outcomes with low ecological impacts, none do so within planetary boundaries. See how they're giving you more and more hints as to what their true intentions are as you go down the article and get closer to the conclusion. The next insight they share with us is for 2050 population. And you notice they all use 2050 as the main date, 2030 and 2050. It's net zero by 2050, they say. And Bill Gates always talks about what is the population going to be by 2050. So for 2050 population, projections from the shared socioeconomic pathways of the IPCC are used, putting aside massive catastrophes and global one-child policies. Now, when I say global one-child policies, I think most of you watching this video, the first thing that comes to your mind is, oh, wow, that was a disaster in China. In other words, a global one-child policy is negative. No. In this article, they reference it as though that would be a good thing. See, putting aside a massive catastrophe or global one-child policies, because that would be really good, because you see, those things would bring down the population to a level that was more sustainable based on the limited resources we have in the world today. The exact same argument Malthus made in the 1800s. And of course, this is all Malthusian. It's just reincarnated versions of what he was saying over 100 years ago. More on that later. Now they start referencing the chart. Finally, modeled energy use of those at decent living standards is similar to current averages in low-consuming countries of the global south, such as India, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. In other words, what we need to strive for is the entire globe using as much energy as they do currently in India, Tanzania, and Ethiopia per capita, which means if we're using that much energy, then the living standards would be the same. So let me make sure we're all on the same page here. So what they're arguing for is the living standards in the Western economies, the rich countries in the world, to be lowered to the current living standards in India, Tanzania, and Ethiopia on a per capita basis. And then we get to where the chart is in the actual article itself. And one thing I want to point out, and I might have made a mistake in step number 1, is the categories they have on the right: super rich, fairly large inequality, fair inequality. These are projections for 2050. Now, on the left, these are representative of what they think are the current levels of energy use in the United States, Germany, Italy, Japan, and then India, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, as we said before. But just wanted to make that clarification that these categories, these arbitrary categories they have on the right, are projections for 2050. And finally, we get to their conclusion. The key message emerging from this work is that inequality substantially increases the energy requirements of securing decent living standards for all. A world where decent living is secured universally, but material inequalities within countries remain close to current levels, could have twice the energy consumption of a more preferable egalitarian world with inequalities based only upon need. And where have we heard that before? Something very similar. Ah, yes. It was a quote from Karl Marx himself, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And they continue by saying an egalitarian world where material inequalities within and between countries are based only upon need is, of course, fantasy. As like, oh, this is our dream, but we know that we'll never achieve this. More realistically, inequalities could be reduced to levels broadly thought to be fair. And this would reduce the need for such high technological ambition or negative emissions. But current economic inequalities are an order of magnitude larger than people consider fair. Well, which people? Ah, that's right. It's the global elite and everyone that buys into this narrative of climate change extremism. And in the absence of drastic structural economic changes, they'll likely remain well beyond fair levels. Let's think through exactly what they're saying. First, an egalitarian world, meaning where everyone was completely equal at every level, would be their fantasy. That would be the best, but it is slightly unrealistic. So what we should strive for is structural economic changes. Well, what economic changes are they referring to? They're referring to an economic system that maximizes, let's say, on egalitarianism. That would be something that you guys know as Marxism. So they're saying that what we need to do is get rid of capitalism. We need to implement Marxism. But even if we do this, then energy consumption will still be too high. Given all this, inequality should be considered as important as traditional drivers of population reduction. Let's be very clear what they're saying. However, the present work should not be used to argue population reduction is unimportant for three reasons. First, large reductions in population growth would result from increasing women's bodily autonomy. Huh? Okay. How does women's bodily autonomy play into this? Oh, that's right. They want them all to get abortions. And this is what they say in a more roundabout way as we proceed. Indeed, globally, half of pregnancies are unintended. And low-income regions, 60% of these go on to be unplanned pregnancies. So what we need to do is just have a lot more abortions, especially with poor people. Second, those arguing overconsumption, not overpopulation, or the benefits of depopulation, let's say, reference very low per capita impacts in high fertility regions today. In other words, all of these places like India or Africa or South America, where they have high fertility rates, they have good demographics, as we would look at it from a macro standpoint, they tend to use very low energy. So why should we reduce the population of the earth? Why don't we just focus on overconsumption? And here's the reason they give. But current consumption is irrelevant unless one condemns these populations to remain at their current living standards, which are incompatible with human flourishing. Ironic, people that are arguing for reducing the population are talking about human flourishing. The important question asks, what would be the ecological impacts of providing these people with good living standards while reducing overconsumption of wealthy global populations? And that's pretty much the gist of their argument. What they want to do is they want to reduce the energy consumption or the living standards within the West or the richer countries in the world. And then what they want to do is they want to reduce the population of the poor countries moving forward. And this is how we solve this Malthusian problem, which to me is evil. I'll let you be the judge on how you would categorize it. And finally, they conclude by saying, however, this focus on impacts in relation to population growth distracts from potentially larger issue exposure to harm. And this is where it goes from evil to just outright insanity. Lower population growth in Africa, for example, may make little difference on global carbon emissions, but it would substantially reduce the population at risk of hunger in a warming world. So what they're literally arguing is they want to reduce the amount of people in the world, because if we do, then fewer people would suffer. Moreover, while it's likely that lower population growth in poorer regions in global south won't slow the momentum of global economy, again, so they see global economic growth as a bad thing. That's what we want to avoid. That's what we want to destroy. They go on to say lower growth would mean there are far fewer people in the regions suffering the worst effects. So again, it's the same idea. Let's just reduce the population of the world, therefore fewer people have to suffer. I mean, based on this line of thinking, you could say, well, oh my gosh, Stalin, he killed 100 million people. And he was a saint, because that means there's 100 million less people on this earth that have to suffer the climate change that is inevitable. And one last thing I want to point out. The author actually says this work has probed the relationship between global ecological impacts, living standards, inequality, and public notions of fairness using highly idealized models with many limitations. So initially you'd think, well, why is he discrediting his own article? But that's because you're misinterpreting what he's saying. He goes on and says, an advantage has been not being constrained by empirical data. So in his view, using highly idealized models with many limitations is actually a good thing, because we're not limited by that pesky empirical data emerging from existing global political and economic structures, which have so far proven unable to respond to the urgency of climate breakdown. So let's not burden ourselves with empirical data. Let's just start reducing the population of the earth, because we know that's the right thing to do. As I always say, shoot first, ask questions later, right? But unfortunately, this is not where the insanity ends. The people who are what I would consider sick in the head continue, and they get even more extreme under the banner, ironically enough, of science. So let's move over to a Forbes article, and this is in the science category. The title is "The Science of Avengers Endgame Proves Thanos Did Nothing Wrong." If you haven't seen the movie, basically wiped out half the population of the planet Earth. So here, the author says, and by the way, when I was reading this, I always thought there'd be like a punchline where he was saying all this, and then at the end, he would say, oh, no, I was just kidding, but obviously we can't do this. No, that he never comes to that conclusion. So he starts by saying, at the end of the Avengers Infinity War, the villain Thanos acquired the Infinity Stones that basically let him snap his fingers, turn half the population to dust. In doing so, Thanos believes he's achieved his goal, a universe free of suffering. His reasoning is simple. On a planet with too many people and limited resources, again, going back to the Malthusian view, the survivors have more than they need, solving the world's problems. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not solving the problems of the 3.5 billion people that just got eradicated. Is Thanos right about overpopulation? His rationale seems to make sense. If we consider our own planet, fewer people ought to mean more food and less hunger, and might lower the risk of an epidemic when overcrowding enables the spread of disease. Odd here that he doesn't point out that half the people on Earth might mean that there's less production of food or less ability to fight disease. But anyway, let's go ahead and bench that for the moment. So he concludes the paragraph by saying, as a consequence, you could conclude that by eliminating 50% of all humans, Thanos did the Earth a huge favor. Next, he argues Thanos believes he's performing a necessary evil that's required to achieve the greater good. You'll notice here they jump from Thomas Malthus all the way back to Machiavelli, another great guy in human history that gave us the term, if you're not familiar with it, the ends justify the means. So why would the Avengers want to reverse the effect of the snap? In other words, why would the Avengers not want to kill 3.5 billion people? The Avengers are guilty of putting the grief of survivors above the health of our world. Just remember, a grown adult is not just thinking this, not just writing this in his personal journal. He is putting this out to the world in Forbes magazine, on the internet, for everyone to see. And this is the same person that would most likely argue that it is inappropriate to not ask someone their personal pronouns. But it is totally appropriate to argue the benefits of eradicating 3.5 billion people. That's the level of insanity we're dealing with here, folks. Step number 3. Now let's go over the real solution to the world's problems we currently face. So it starts, and it's very simple, by pretty much doing the opposite of what the global elite and the people we've discussed throughout this video want to do. So let's take this back to the cerveza sickness. Makes a lot of sense. What did the people who were following the science encourage us or force us to do? They locked you in a cage. They locked you in your house. Well, now looking back in retrospect, we know that was the absolute worst thing we could have done if, big if, the goal was actually to prevent or reduce the spread or the impact of the cerveza sickness. Why? Because it spreads a lot less outside. Now let's fast forward to today when we're talking about inflation, consumer prices going up. What do these politicians and central planners suggest we do? What are their current solutions to the problems? If they're following the science, let's say, of the mainstream economists. Well, their solution is to lower supply and increase demand. We'll just give out stimmy checks, and then we'll just, again, lock everyone in a cage, or we'll just increase the taxes on the people who are actually producing the stuff. Therefore, again, decrease supply, increase demand, prices go up. So what they should be doing is the complete opposite. Just like they should have encouraged people to go outside, get exercise, and eat healthy during the cerveza sickness, now they should be doing everything they can to discourage demand and increase supply. So it should come as no surprise that the solutions outlined in step 1 and 2, the global elites, the crazies, we'll call them, are pretty much the opposite of what we need to do. So let's go through a very simple example that I give on a lot of whiteboard videos. We give 3 people that are, in this case, actually a little bit different from the standpoint of the 3 people are all growing or producing what they need to provide for their families. It's a very agricultural society. So you've got these 3 gentlemen here, and they both, or all 3 of them, produce cattle, corn, and cotton because this is what they need to survive. But they can only produce enough for themselves and their families. Well, if we increase productivity, then what happens? Well, now, let's say one of these people can produce all the cows, corn, and cotton that the collective total needs. So this times 3. I've got the little simple version here on the whiteboard. So what that does is it frees up the other people, the other 2 people, to do other things. They don't have to grow their own food. They don't have to raise their own cattle or grow their own cotton for their clothing. They've got someone else to do that because he is highly productive. So they can become an engineer. I don't know, maybe an engineer that could create better equipment so society could become even more productive. And it frees up the other person to become, I don't know, maybe a scientist, maybe someone that could actually solve the problems that were outlined in step 1 and 2. Maybe this person can solve the problem of, let's just say, pollution, or maybe they can solve the problem of the energy crisis that we face from a standpoint of we are running out of cheap energy sources that are highly dense. And what I mean by that is they have a very high energy ROI. So let's get into that. You guys know that ROI is return on investment. And they have a measurement for energy that pretty much is the exact same thing. They call it something else, but at the end of the day, same thing. So how much energy has to go in order to get X amount of energy out? So if you think about an oil well or producing coal or producing lumber, there's man hours or labor or calories, energy, that is burnt by just producing that energy source. So ideally, you want an energy source that is as dense as possible. Or, said another way, an energy source that has as little input for the most maximum amount of output. And you may be asking yourself, okay, George, well, that sounds great, but why is that such a big deal? Well, let's think this through. If being more productive allows more people to do other things like solve the world's problems, then having a more dense energy source requires fewer people to actually produce the energy needed to run the productive output of the one person in this example that is raising the cattle, growing the corn, and producing the cotton. A perfect example of how this plays out in the real world was given in a recent podcast episode from my good buddy Simon Black. So if you haven't listened to or subscribed to his podcast, Sovereign Man, you've got to do that right away. It's one of my favorites. But he goes all the way back to 1776, a date that is important for a lot of us. But what he points out is something that was probably even more important than the birth of the United States was the invention of the steam engine. Why? Because this allowed us to create a machine that would do the work of several people. Now, initially, the source of energy for the steam engine was wood. But think about the amount of energy that was required in collecting the amount of wood needed to increase the productivity that we now had as a result of the invention of a steam engine. So you had to have all these human beings out there that were burning calories or using energy. So the ROI, as far as the energy inputs relative to the amount of energy on the output, was relatively low for wood. But then all of a sudden we got coal, something that was far more dense. So let's just say, as an example, the ratio on wood was 1 to 10. Well, now all of a sudden with coal, we've got something that's 1 to 100. And I don't know if those are exact numbers, just using them for the sake of the example so you guys understand the concept. So what happened is we required a lot less energy to produce the energy needed to run these steam engines, to increase productivity, to increase the standard of living, which freed up human beings to flourish, to invent all the other miracles that we saw during the late 1800s and into the 1900s, the Industrial Revolution. So the real solution to climate change is not reducing the population of the Earth and using a less dense energy source. It's increasing the population of the Earth using more dense energy sources, or more of the dense energy sources we currently have at our disposal, to free up the human capital, to free up the human mind, the people on Earth, to solve these difficult problems, just like they did in the 1800s when Thomas Malthus presented these problems in the first place, just like they did in the 1970s when the Club of Rome and the World Economic Forum popularized these ideas once again, and just like they will into the future if we allow human ingenuity to do what it has done throughout history. That is solving difficult problems, even the problem of population growth in a world with limited resources. So if you want cleaner air, you need more people, not less people. You need a higher standard of living, not a lower standard of living, especially for the poor people in the South that they referenced in step number 2. And then finally, you need more energy, not less energy. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here. I'll see you on the next video.